Ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about the human mind, we often imagine it as a machine of logic, reason, and memory. But what we tend to forget is that beneath the circuits of intelligence, beneath the achievements and the public triumphs, there lives a far quieter, more private world, the emotional one. That's the world where people truly reveal themselves. It's not in headlines, not in interviews, but in those unseen moments. When the lights are off, when the doors close, and when all that remains is a person facing the weight of what love, loss, and memory really mean. Tonight, I want to take you behind the scenes, not into fame or technology, but into the silent chambers of the human mind, into what happens when lives intertwined with great ambition begin to unravel. Because the story of anyone who has touched greatness, and those who stood beside them, is not written in public. It's written in the hidden corners of emotion, of reflection, and of change. When we look at the lives of the women who once shared a home, a dream, and a future with a man whose vision extended beyond Earth itself, we often reduce them to footnotes. We see them through the lens of tabloids, filtered through public narratives. But behind the scenes, there are no scripts. There are human beings grappling with what it means to love someone who belongs as much to the future as to the present. And understanding their private reactions, the truth of their inner world, offers us something profound about the psychology of human connection and resilience. Every relationship, especially one tied to a person of extraordinary drive, becomes a psychological experiment, not in a lab, but in real life. Imagine being married to a dreamer whose waking hours are consumed not by comfort, but by an obsession to change the trajectory of humanity. You begin each morning not with, "What are we having for breakfast?" but, "What problem are you trying to solve today?" And that rhythm of living beside genius slowly begins to rewire your brain's emotional architecture. Neuroscience has a term for this empathic strain. It's what happens when one person's intensity creates emotional turbulence in another. The brain, constantly attuned to the signals of those we love, begins to mirror their stress. In MRI studies, when one partner experiences prolonged anxiety or hyper-focus, the other's neural patterns begin to synchronize, even if they don't share the same obsession. That's how emotional ecosystems form. You don't need to be on the rocket to feel the acceleration. You just need to love the one who is building it. Now imagine that for years. The dopamine rush of ambition, the sleepless cycles, the shifting between moments of euphoria and near collapse. That environment becomes both exhilarating and exhausting. Many who've lived close to such energy describe it as standing near a perpetual lightning storm, electrifying, luminous, and yet, at times, destructive. And in the private rooms of those relationships, you find the duality of admiration and ache, because love for someone extraordinary often means negotiating with loneliness in extraordinary ways. One of the most revealing aspects of post-relationship neuroscience comes from the study of emotional residue. The brain's lingering attachment, even after physical separation. When we lose someone, our neural pathways don't instantly rewire. In fact, functional brain scans of people recalling lost love show activation in the same regions that respond to physical pain. To the brain, heartbreak isn't metaphorical, it's literal. Emotional separation is, biologically speaking, an amputation of identity. And for the women who once shared life with a mind constantly reaching toward Mars, the amputation isn't just personal, it's existential. They're not only separating from a person, they're detaching from an entire gravitational field. Think about that. To orbit a person whose life is defined by velocity, by the next invention, the next breakthrough. And then one day, that orbit collapses. The silence afterward feels infinite. Some of them describe that silence not as sadness, but as a strange kind of relief mixed with nostalgia. That's something psychology calls ambiguous grief, the paradoxical blend of loss and freedom. You grieve what you had, yet feel lighter without it. It's the human brain's way of adapting to complexity, holding two truths at once without letting either destroy you. We don't talk about this enough. We talk about genius, but not about its emotional collateral. We glorify obsession, but rarely ask you, what does it cost those who live beside it? And yet, the private reactions of those women, in their resilience, their reflections, their quiet dignity, show us something more vital than fame ever could. That emotional intelligence often begins not in victory, but in recovery. In one conversation, a former partner once described the years following separation as a slow recalibration. She said, "I had to remember who I was when no one was building rockets in the background." That statement carries profound neurological truth. Because identity, in long-term partnerships, becomes a shared construct. Neuroscientists call this the self-expansion model, where each partner incorporates aspects of the other into their own sense of self. When that relationship ends, part of your neural self concept dissolves. The brain literally has to rebuild its map of me. But the rebuilding process, though painful, also sparks new neural growth. There's something called experience-dependent plasticity, the brain's ability to form new synaptic connections in response to emotional transformation. In simpler terms, heartbreak rewires you, but it can also make you more complex, more creative, more alive. Many people who have endured profound emotional loss report bursts of unexpected insight and creativity afterward. It's as if the brain, deprived of its familiar emotional rhythm, begins composing new music just to survive the silence. So, what did they do with that silence? They reflected. They wrote. They began to see their own lives not as supporting roles, but as autonomous journeys. Each of them, in her own way, evolved into something extraordinary, not in the shadow of a famous name, but in the clarity of her own purpose. Behind every narrative of separation, there's an unseen process, the alchemy of emotion into understanding. When you go through heartbreak, your prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for reasoning, tries to make sense of the chaos. It searches for meaning, for cause, for lesson, for closure. That search is painful, but it's also where growth begins. For many of those women, the realization came that loving someone extraordinary doesn't mean losing yourself, unless you let the orbit define your gravity. And that realization, that freedom, is what makes their private reactions so deeply human. Some found peace in their children, some in creativity, others in silence. But all of them found clarity in understanding that being part of someone else's dream doesn't diminish your own. When I reflect on these stories, not as gossip, but as human data, I see a profound pattern in the neuroscience of emotional evolution. Love and loss are not opposites. They are different stages of the same neural process. Love expands our neural connections, loss refines them. Love adds complexity, loss restores clarity. Together, they sculpt who we are. The private reactions of those who once lived within the storm of genius are not stories of bitterness or regret. They are stories of recalibration, of learning how to exist again in ordinary light after years of living beside lightning. And when you step back and observe that, when you look at it not as a journalist or a critic but as a neuroscientist, you begin to see something extraordinary. Human beings are adaptive beyond imagination. We can love deeply, break completely, and still rebuild with more wisdom than we ever had before. Each of those women represents a different form of that adaptation. One turned pain into literature. Another turned silence into meditation. Another turned heartbreak into empathy for others navigating similar paths. That's emotional evolution. That's neural growth through experience. It's not glamorous. It doesn't make headlines. But it's real. And if you look closely, behind every story of separation from greatness, there is always a quieter story of someone learning that emotional survival is not about avoiding pain, but about transforming it. When we understand that, we stop seeing relationships as failures when they end. Instead, we begin to see them as completed experiments in human connection, each teaching us something unique about the brain, the heart, and the invisible threads that tie them together. Because the truth is, no relationship truly ends. It changes form. It lives in the neural architecture of memory, in the small reflexes of thought, in the way we speak or dream, or even pause before saying a certain name. Love leaves fingerprints in the brain, and those fingerprints, even when faded, are what make us human. And perhaps that's the most haunting and beautiful truth of all, that love, even when gone, continues to alter the brain as if it were still present. It's not an illusion, it's biology. The anterior cingulate cortex, responsible for regulating emotions and empathy, doesn't distinguish much between love remembered and love lived. That's why those who once loved deeply often carry a quiet tenderness long after the story ends. They have been changed at a molecular level. Their emotional circuitry now recognizes compassion, not as an abstract virtue, but as lived experience. I remember reading an observation from a neuropsychologist who said that the most powerful transformations happen not in the moments of discovery, but in the aftermath of loss. Because loss is what compels the brain to update its model of the world. When the person you loved, the person around whom your emotional universe revolved, is no longer there, your mind is forced to reorganize itself. It's like a galaxy recalibrating after a supernova. The gravitational pull that once defined everything is gone, and yet, from that collapse, new constellations begin to form. This is what those women experience behind the scenes. Not public breakdowns, not dramatized reactions, but quiet neurological rebirths. They had to become architects of their own new identities. Each moment of silence, each private evening spent reflecting, was not an act of despair but one of reconstruction. The human brain, in its remarkable resilience, begins to fill emotional voids with new meaning. That's why so many people who emerge from heartbreak often appear wiser, calmer, and somehow more radiant. They've experienced emotional reconfiguration at the deepest level. What fascinates me most is how each of them found peace not by denying their past, but by integrating it. Integration, in psychological terms, is when the left hemisphere's logic and the right hemisphere's emotion finally reconcile. When reason stops trying to erase feeling, and feeling stops trying to control reason, that's where healing happens. And that's where you begin to see the grace in their private reactions. They didn't reject the memory of love, they metabolized it. In a conversation with one of them, whose name I won't mention out of respect, she said something profoundly simple. You can't be angry at a storm for being a storm. That sentence encapsulates emotional intelligence. It means accepting that some people, by nature, are forces of motion, constantly driven by something larger than themselves. To love them is to dance with chaos. To leave them is to find stillness. But both experiences are sacred because they reveal the entire emotional spectrum of what it means to be alive. And when the storm passes, what's left isn't wreckage, it's clarity. The realization that love doesn't need permanence to be meaningful. It just needs authenticity while it lasts. That understanding shifts the entire landscape of the mind. Studies on oxytocin memory show that even when romantic attachment fades, the neural pathways formed during those bonds remain. The person may move on, but the capacity for empathy, for compassion, for patience, all those neural muscles remain stronger than before. That's why when people look at those ex-wives and imagine bitterness, they misunderstand human psychology entirely. What they carry is not resentment, it's perspective. They've seen the full intensity of what ambition can do to a heart. They've watched love compete with purpose, and they've understood that sometimes purpose wins. And instead of collapsing under that truth, they transcended it. Because emotional maturity is not about avoiding pain, it's about metabolizing it into wisdom. And that's precisely what they've done. Each of them, in her own way, took the emotional residue of that relationship and turned it into a form of evolution. One became a writer, using words as a map to navigate the unseen corridors of her experience. Another became an advocate for mindfulness and self-awareness, teaching others how to find calm within the chaos. These are not the marks of victims. These are the marks of emotional pioneers. And here's something extraordinary that neuroscience reveals: post-traumatic growth is just as real as post-traumatic stress. The same neural mechanisms that process pain can under the right conditions, be repurposed to generate resilience, creativity, and even joy. The key lies in meaning. If you can attach meaning to your suffering, if you can frame your experience as growth instead of defeat, the hippocampus begins to encode it differently. What was once a wound becomes a lesson. What was once chaos becomes coherence. Behind closed doors, that's what they did. They rethored their narratives. Instead of being remembered as the woman who lost, they became women who learned. Women who chose to understand instead of resent. And that's a profound act of intelligence. Not just emotional, but neurological. Because understanding literally reconfigures the pathways of the brain. It transforms reactive emotion into reflective awareness. There's a saying in clinical psychology, the brain heals in story. It means that when you articulate your experience, when you find language for your pain, you bring order to neural chaos. Those women, in their own ways, told their stories to themselves and to others. And that storytelling became their therapy, their reconstruction, their quiet revolution. Through that, they didn't just heal, they evolved. Sometimes, late at night, I think about what it must feel like to have shared life with someone whose destiny was to reach beyond human limits. The pride, the exhaustion, the awe, the distance. To have watched the same person speak of colonizing Mars while forgetting to sleep on Earth. And I realized something profound. Love for someone extraordinary requires extraordinary emotional bandwidth. And even when it ends, that bandwidth doesn't close. It stays open, capable of carrying greater empathy for the rest of one's life. This is the beauty of emotional neuroplasticity. The brain's ability to keep learning how to love, even after it's been broken. The brain never truly gives up on connection. It just learns to connect differently. The same circuits that once activated for romantic attachment can later activate for purpose, for children, for art, for humanity itself. In that sense, the end of one form of love often births another. The women who once loved that man may no longer orbit him, but they now orbit something else, their own evolution. And this is where science meets spirit. Because neuroscience can explain how the brain adapts, but it can't fully capture why the human heart keeps choosing to. That why belongs to something deeper. The mystery of consciousness itself, that quiet force that compels us to heal, to forgive, to keep hoping even when the evidence tells us not to. Every ex-wife, every former partner, every person who has loved and lost carries that same question in their hearts: how do I move forward without erasing where I've been? And the answer, whispered through the corridors of psychology, biology, and lived experience, is this: you don't erase it. You integrate it. You let the memories stay, not as weights, but as coordinates, markers of where you've been so you can chart where you're going. You stop running from your own history and instead use it as a compass. That's what emotional evolution really is. Not forgetting, but transforming. And perhaps that's why, if you were to see them now, years later, far removed from the noise of fame, you'd notice something serene in their eyes. They've witnessed the full spectrum of human emotion. They've stood beside genius and walked away intact. That serenity doesn't come from indifference. It comes from understanding. It comes from the peace of having lived deeply and survived beautifully. If there's a universal lesson in their private reactions, it's this: love will always be the greatest experiment in human history. It tests our patience, our identity, our capacity for empathy. It exposes our fragility and our strength. And every relationship, even the ones that end, contributes data to the grand research project of what it means to be human. So when we look at those women, we shouldn't see them as chapters closed. We should see them as continuing hypotheses, as living proof that even after emotional collapse, consciousness evolves. The neurons regrow, the soul recalibrates, the story continues. And that's where the beauty lies, not in the perfection of love, but in its impermanence. Because impermanence is what makes every connection precious. It reminds us that love, like life, is finite, and therefore sacred. To have loved once, truly, is to have touched eternity in a moment. And that moment, however brief, rewires you forever. So, ladies and gentlemen, behind the scenes of what the world calls separation, there exists something far greater than sorrow. There exists growth. There exists grace. There exists the quiet, unstoppable brilliance of human resilience. And in the end, that's the real story. Not of loss, not of fame, but of evolution. The evolution of the human heart, endlessly breaking, endlessly becoming. And maybe that's all we're ever meant to do. To love, to lose, to learn to become. Thank you.